Monday Nitro, Monday Night Raw. The Monday Night Wars is undoubtedly one of the biggest milestones in professional wrestling. However, how much of a war was it really? Now, I don't mean in the violent sense of the word, but I more mean in terms of strategy. Now, if only there was a book that has been time-tested for hundreds of years that focused on that exact topic. Well, fortunately, there is. And both of these are the topic of this episode, because today, Dave knows the art of the Monday Night War. The Art of War was a book written by Sun Tzu, which taught the best practices for winning military battle. However, in the centuries that have passed since its creation, many have adapted the book's tactics for everything from sports to even business. And that's where we find ourselves today. Do the Monday Night Wars play out just like real wars do? Well, at least according to Sun Tzu. Well, we're about to find out, but first allow me to say that The Art of War is a very complex book, and I'm just taking a few quotes and comparing them to wrestling. This is in no way a thorough retelling of the book, and there is plenty of information that I am leaving out here. Just think of this as a very brief sampling of cherry-picked lifted text. Because if I was going into a thorough retelling of this book, this video would be obscenely long. So now let's start comparing a few things of Sun Tzu's strategies to what happened in the Monday Night Wars. Now, as we all know, the WWF won the war in the end, but did they do it using the tactics as laid out by the Art of War book? Well, let's find out. Appear weak when you are strong, and strong when you are weak. The Art of War spoke a lot about deception, and that war itself is all about misrepresentation. So this statement definitely echoes that main principle. Now, who did this better? Well, it depends on what you determine as strength. For me, money is definitely something that I am inclined to say is a measure of strength when it comes to these two companies. And when we look at WCW during a time when they seemingly had unlimited funds, they definitely flaunted it. And while it was no secret that the WWF was not as well funded as WCW, WWF never came across as a poor company. Now, this is a narrow margin, but I definitely see how McMahon applied this strategy more so than Eric Bischoff. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Man, that's deep. Alright, now in this instance, I will say that Eric Bischoff knew the WWF fairly okay. After all, Raw did come first, and Bischoff did study Raw when he made Nitro, and he even had many of WWF's old wrestlers under his employ, such as Hogan, the Macho Man, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash, just to name a few. And eventually even some of WWF's writing staff, such as Vince Russo. However, WWF had many of WCW's former talent too, such as Stone Cold Steve Austin and Mick Foley. And I think that might be the point. Bischoff knew what he got from the WWF, but I don't think he knew what he lost. Bischoff himself thought wrestlers like Steve Austin, Mick Foley, and Triple H were just not marketable. So while he may have known his enemy to a degree, it didn't seem like he knew himself all that well. Vince, on the other hand, was born into the business and knew his company's strengths and weaknesses very well. And he definitely knew exactly what he was giving up with Hogan, Bret, and Vince Russo. So it's fair to say that Vince just knew the players better than Eric did. Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go into war first and then seek to win. Yet again, this definitely sums up the battle between the two. WWF had been the driving force in the wrestling business for decades. They had already won. Bischoff created Nitro and just put it directly against Raw, even though WCW was starting at a deficit. And as for the WWF, well, when they began as their own company by breaking off from the NWA, their New York market was sustaining them very well. And even then, they weren't directly competing with the NWA, they were just doing their own thing. When Vince started WrestleMania or Monday Night Raw, it was going unopposed. There was no other wrestling show on at that exact same time on national TV. Vince mostly explored unclaimed turf, while Bischoff wanted to attack Vince in his very own backyard. Brave move, but maybe not the most effective one in the long term. If your enemy is secure at all points, be prepared for him. If he is in superior strength, evade him. If your opponent is temperamental, seek to irritate him. Pretend to be weak, and he may grow arrogant. If he is taking his ease, give him no rest. If his forces are united, separate them. If sovereign and subject are in accord, put division between them. Attack him where he is unprepared. Appear where you are not expected. This overall mentality even led ECW to the height of its success. WWF didn't try to compete with WCW financially, they knew they couldn't. Vince even let Bret Hart go when he realized that even attempting to keep him would be a costly endeavor. McMahon never competed where he couldn't win, and by letting top talent go, Vince did appear pretty weak and WCW did grow rather arrogant. And by letting people like Brett and Vince Russo go, it was Vince McMahon being very, very unexpected. It was so unprecedented that many still wonder if Vince McMahon sent them in on purpose to destroy WCW from within. When you surround an army, leave an outlet free. Do not press a desperate foe too hard. Towards the end, WWF stopped picking on WCW. Like now, where the WWE never really brings up TNA, WWF rarely brings up their competition when they are completely dominating. The DX invasion on WCW, this kind of thing was done while the war was still competitive. When WCW was on its last legs, Vince already knew he had the win and couldn't really be bothered kicking the company while it was down. Instead, WWF just lets its rival companies starve themselves out. But as was the case for WCW, they offered them one last chance to surrender by buying them out, leaving them one outlet and not pressing the desperate foe too much. Thus, we may know that there are 5 essentials for victory. He will win who knows when to fight and when not to fight. He will win who knows how to handle both superior and inferior forces. He will win whose army is animated by the same spirit throughout its ranks. He will win who prepared himself, waits to take the enemy unprepared. He will win who has military capacity and is not interfered with by the sovereign. Okay, this one is a loaded one, but it is some really good stuff. First, knowing when to fight and when not to. As I mentioned, Vince McMahon knew when to attack. However, when Bischoff on the other hand had Schiavone ruin the ending to Mick Foley winning the belt, he thought that was a good move, but it backfired. WWF wound up drawing the better rating that night. That was not the right time to attack, and nor was it the right battle to fight. These were the kind of mistakes that Bischoff made that Vince mostly avoided. Secondly, handling both superior and inferior forces. Vince proved that he could dominate with a variety of talent. WWF was on top with Hulk Hogan, but it was also on top with Austin and Foley, who WCW just discarded. McMahon proved that no matter who his staff was, he could lead them to victory. Thirdly, animated by the same spirit. Well, what can I say? WWF attitude pretty much says it all. WCW had great variety, but a lot of issues backstage with politics and infighting. People mad at Hogan or people mad at Flair. This splintered locker room showed that the wrestlers were not all on the same page. WWF, on the other hand, did have a few people unhappy with the way things were, but as a whole, had more of a unified staff in the end, especially in their main event scene. The most splintered WWF ever got was around the time of the Screwjob, during a time when they were actually losing the war. But as soon as guys like Austin, The Rock, Mick Foley, Triple H, Kane, The Undertaker all became their top guys, well, then the infighting mostly stopped. These wrestlers all had the WWF attitude and all represented that new outlook that the company had. The way I see it, this overall showing of unity was a big part in what led to their ultimate victory. Next, being prepared and waiting to take the enemy. Again, WWF did a lot of unexpected things, but when they finally bought WCW, it was a huge shock when it happened. WWF had repeatedly stated that they were not interested in purchasing WCW, and that Bischoff seemed like the obvious frontrunner. Then, almost all of a sudden, WWF announced that they were going to buy WCW. Needless to say, this purchase was something Bischoff was just not prepared for. And finally, having military capacity and no interference by the sovereign. By the time the Monday Night Wars started to wind down, there were many big WCW names that had already jumped over, like the Radicals, The Big Show, and Chris Jericho. And as for interference from the sovereign, Vince answers to no one. He controls the company where Bischoff had Time Warner to answer to. And when he tried to buy WCW, he also had a series of investors that he had to contend with. Vince had a much clearer path because he served as both general and commander-in-chief. Following all these strategies, and I think it's safe to say that Vince McMahon and the WWF won in the end because they knew the art of the Monday Night War. But what do you think? What are some other Art of War principles, and how do you think they apply to the Monday Night Wars? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, this has been Dave Knows.